Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Quiet Warrior, a biography of Admiral Raymond A. Spruance by Thomas B. Buell, narrated by Chris Monteiro. Introduction. What are the essential features that combine to create a truly effective biography? Certainly it is easy to detect their absence. Some purported biographers merely recite in broad fashion the primary events surrounding the life of their subject and sprinkle a few entertaining anecdotes into the narrative. They offer no deep insights into the individual's personality or his way of thinking. In creating the setting in which their hero or villain lived, worked, prospered, or declined, they are apt to become so engrossed with collateral events and stage setting that they lose sight of their subject. The principal goal of a biography is to help the listener understand what a person was actually like, how he viewed life, and how he reacted to the challenges that it posed. Thus, it is not only vital to have a grasp of what he did, but also to know why he did it. Only in that way is it possible to measure the man, to assess his strengths and weaknesses, and, most important, to gauge his impact upon events and his fellow men. At first glance, Admiral Raymond A. Spruance would seem an ideal subject for a naval biography, particularly a superficial one. All the major events of his naval career took place at such a lofty level that the whole Pacific Fleet, even many civilians at home, knew in a general way what he did in World War II. Hundreds of documents and many books describe what the forces under his command were able to accomplish. What was Spruance's role in the victory over Japan? First of all, he emerged as the key leader in the most famous carrier action of history, the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Then, after a year's tour of duty as Chief of Staff to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, CINCPAC, Spruance was given the Fifth Fleet. This became the principal Pacific Fleet Amphibious Command, charged with conducting the invasions of the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and the climactic assault on Okinawa. Spruance directed the vital thrust through the Central Pacific towards the Japanese home islands. Along with Nimitz and Admiral William F. Halsey, he stood in the first rank of naval leaders in the Pacific War. As an individual, however, Spruance presents extraordinary problems for a biographer. He was a very private person, unemotional and undemonstrative in public. To a great degree, he was unconcerned about his image, caring little for glory in the conventional sense. His gods were logic and reason. The character of Mr. Spock in the popular science fiction series Star Trek could easily have been patterned after Spruance. The Admiral competed not with others, but with his own impossibly high self-expectations, and that is the way he judged his successes and failures. A man who relied on deeds rather than words to make his mark, Spruance seemed oblivious to what posterity would think of him. He did not like to speak publicly, nor did he do much writing if he could avoid it. He authored no wordy, self-justifying memoirs. His achievements, intellect, and integrity were responsible for the great respect accorded him by his peers. For a number of reasons, Thomas B. Buell's The Quiet Warrior is able to surmount these difficulties and get to the heart of the man. As a naval officer, Buell shared many of the same experiences, albeit 2 generations later, that shaped the young Spruance. Like Spruance, he attended the U.S. Naval Academy, learned the ropes at sea and ashore, gradually accepting more responsibilities. Both men knew the joys and perils of commanding destroyers. Finally, both profited from a close association with the U.S. Naval War College. The similarities in their backgrounds gave Buell an insight into the challenges Spruance faced in his earlier career and how he applied the lessons he learned to his commands during the war years. Buell had the great good fortune of meeting the man whose biography he would write. Also, he had access to Spruance's letters to some of his close associates and to other historians. However, because Spruance did not often record what he thought or felt, it became vital that Buell assess the man by determining his impact upon others, particularly those who were near to him, his family and his staff. Mrs. Margaret Dean Spruance, the Admiral's wife, and Margaret Spruance Bogart, his daughter, offered Buell an intimate look at the private Spruance through the eyes of those closest to him. Equally important was the testimony of several officers who served on his staff. Two especially valuable witnesses were his longtime friend and Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Charles J. Carl Moore, and his Flag Lieutenant, Captain Robert J. Oliver. The outcome of Buell's research and insight is a masterpiece of American biography, a work whose evocation of its elusive subject can be favorably compared to Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison's classic, John Paul Jones, A Sailor's Biography. Perhaps the most important, though certainly not the fairest, way of judging an historical study is to assess its influence upon subsequent works dealing with the same subject. In other words, how does one book affect those that follow? By that criterion alone, The Quiet Warrior commands respect. It has come to be accepted as the authentic portrait of Raymond Spruance. Ever since its publication in 1974, virtually all historians who have dealt with Spruance in any significant way have cited this book. Whether or not these authors have chosen to adopt Buell's conclusions, they could not afford to overlook them. What is particularly interesting to this writer is the manner in which other authors have reacted to the sections in Buell's book that deal with Spruance's two most controversial command decisions. Both concern his conduct of carrier operations, the first in the Battle of Midway in June 1942, and the second almost precisely 2 years later in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Coming up through the ranks as a surface ship commander from destroyers to battleships, Spruance was largely unfamiliar with the intricacies of naval aviation and carrier operations in particular. Whether or not this lack of specialized experience was detrimental to his handling of a carrier task force in battle is debatable. Certain aviators thought so, however, and smarted at serving under a non-aviator who they felt did not really understand carriers and their capabilities. The reports of Spruance's role in the victory at Midway, and how this role has come to be viewed by others, offer an instructive example as to the manner in which history is written and illuminate some of the pitfalls that ensnare unwary historians, who have either misread the evidence themselves or depended upon others who have. Historical myths, once planted, are almost impossible to eradicate. Spruance's actions at Midway have engendered a small but tenacious myth, which Buell's book does its utmost to dispel, though not altogether successfully. To follow the growth of this myth, some background information is necessary. In late May 1942, as the Pacific Fleet readied itself to do battle with the Japanese combined fleet near the tiny Central Pacific island of Midway, its main carrier commander, Vice Admiral Halsey, fell ill. Placed in overall command of the 3 U.S. carriers available was Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, a non-aviator who earlier that month had won the Battle of the Coral Sea, the first carrier versus carrier confrontation in history. To exercise direct control over Task Force 16 with 2 of the 3 carriers, the Enterprise, CV-6, and the Hornet, CV-8, Halsey nominated his cruiser force commander, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Admiral Nimitz accepted his choice. Spruance thereupon shifted his flag to the Enterprise, where, with the exception of his own flag lieutenant, Lieutenant Robert J. Oliver, he inherited Halsey's aviation staff under Captain Miles R. Browning, a most outspoken, prickly, and irascible individual. Perhaps the aviators expected the quiet Spruance to sit back and let the more experienced aviation staff run the carriers. Such was not to be the case. The morning of 4 June, the American carriers waited in ambush northeast of Midway. Their primary targets were the 4 or 5 Japanese flat tops radio intelligence indicated were leading the enemy advance. They expected the first Japanese move to be a dawn airstrike against Midway. While Fletcher conducted an air search, Spruance made ready to attack with nearly the full power of his two carrier air groups. He needed only a firm position report of the enemy flat tops to send his strike planes toward their targets. Finally, almost 2 hours after dawn, a patrol plane report placed two of the Japanese carriers 175 miles southwest of Task Force 16. Fletcher, who also intercepted the message, ordered Spruance to launch his attack as soon as the enemy carriers were definitely located. At this point, matters become controversial. According to most accounts, Spruance was worried about the range of his carrier aircraft, particularly his torpedo planes. Supposedly, he thought that because the reported enemy position could be inaccurate, his planes might have to use up time and fuel searching for the enemy, reducing their effective range. Because of his worry over these factors, Spruance is said to have made the highly conservative decision to wait 3 hours until his force, streaming at 25 knots, could decrease the distance between itself and the enemy to 100 miles. Then he would launch his strike. What the Japanese would be doing for those 3 hours is not considered in these accounts. At this juncture, Miles Browning is alleged to have intervened to persuade his neophyte carrier boss to dispatch his strike in 1 rather than 3 hours, that is, at a range of 150 rather than 100 miles. Browning's motives, according to this version, were first not to keep his carriers exposed to attack in their most vulnerable condition, with fueled and armed planes on deck, and second, to catch the Japanese precisely in that situation after they had landed their Midway attack groups. Spruance is said to have bowed to the superior logic of his chief of staff and rescinded his orders in order to launch when Browning recommended. Most of Task Force 16's planes did find the enemy, and in combination with aircraft from the Yorktown, CV-5, sank 3 of the 4 enemy carriers, a stunning victory. Browning later received the lion's share of praise for victory at Midway, at least among the aviation community. Indeed, he was decorated with the Distinguished Service Medal, the citation for which included the following passage. 3. Order recorded in the Task Force 16 War Diary, June 4, 1942, in the Operational Archives, Naval Historical Center, Washington, D.C. By his judicious planning and brilliant execution, he was largely responsible for the rout of the enemy Japanese fleet in the Battle of Midway. One naval historian has called Browning's action the shrewdest decision in the history of carrier warfare. In researching Spruance's role in the victory at Midway, Buell came up with a totally different version of the decision to launch the strike. He talked at length with Captain Oliver, who was present during the deliberations. On the basis of Oliver's clear recollections, Buell concluded that Browning never talked Spruance out of delaying the launch, because the Admiral did not propose to delay it. Both Spruance and Browning wanted to strike the Japanese carriers as quickly as possible. Spruance simply ordered Browning to launch the attack, and Browning, after some calculations, suggested that the planes take off about an hour later, when Task Force 16 would have closed to about 150 miles of the target. The reasons behind Browning's suggestion can easily be deduced. The prevailing wind was from the southeast. To conduct flight operations, the Enterprise and the Hornet would have to turn into the wind and steam away from the Japanese at 25 knots for as long as it took to launch the 132 aircraft of the strike groups and combat air patrol. Browning knew that by the time so many planes took off, formed up, and departed, nearly an hour would have passed, and the range to the enemy would have opened to 175 miles. That is what happened. It had been necessary to close to 150 miles before launching to ensure that the aircraft would not have to fly farther than 175 miles, the accepted maximum effective radius of action, to reach their target. This was Browning's contribution. Interestingly, one post-war study, conducted by the Naval War College when Spruance was its president, actually commended the Admiral for not launching immediately once the contact report was received. After the time it took to launch them, his aircraft would have been at their extreme range, 200 miles. Spruance was willing to wait 45 minutes to put his planes 25 miles closer to the enemy and give them a greater margin of fuel to search for the enemy if need be. Fletcher's Air Task Group commander at Coral Sea, Rear Admiral Aubrey W. Fitch, had launched his 7 May strike at 200 miles, which he felt was within the capability of the aircraft, and so it was. Buell marshaled strong, virtually overwhelming evidence for his case. In 2 instances, his version was accepted. By this writer in his book The First Team, Annapolis, 1984, and by Ronald H. Spector in Eagle Against the Sun, New York, 1985. One highly popular recent account of Midway seems to try to have it both ways. In the late Gordon Prang's Miracle at Midway, New York, 1982, which cites the Quiet Warrior in its bibliography, Spruance is quoted as telling Browning to launch everything you have at the earliest possible moment and strike the enemy carriers. The next page reverts to the old story, in which Spruance intended to delay the launch until he had closed to within 100 miles of the target and was dissuaded by Browning. This account is confused, to say the least. In discussing the 2 versions of the Spruance-Browning incident, references to specific times have been deliberately omitted until now. With Buell's findings as a guide to an original document relating to the battle, it becomes possible to explain how this myth arose. Virtually all published accounts of the battle use Midway local time, in Greenwich Civil Time, Zone +12, as their chronological framework. This would put the key times of the mythical version as 0603. Spruance received the sighting report placing the enemy carriers 175 miles southwest. 0900. Spruance's intended launch time when his carriers, after streaming 3 hours at 25 knots, would have closed to within 100 miles of the enemy. 0700. The launch time advocated by Browning 2 hours earlier than Spruance proposed, and the time the strike was actually launched at the enemy 155 miles away. In examining the original documentation of the Midway operations, one quickly discovers that the U.S. carrier task forces did not operate on Midway local time, Zone +12, but on Zone +10, or 2 hours ahead of Midway local time. It was a sort of daylight saving time. Dawn on 4 June, according to Midway local time, was 04:15, while on board the carriers it was reckoned as 06:15. All of Task Force 16's documents are recorded in time Zone +10. When survivors of the battle are asked to recall specific events, they invariably do so in the context of the time they actually used, that is, Zone +10. Nevertheless, in 1943, a Navy combat narrative on Midway, which has become the standard source of all subsequent historical narratives, converted all times to Midway local time, Zone +12, thus creating the resultant confusion. Convert the 3 listed times in Zone +12 time, 0603, 0900, and 0700, back to Zone +10, 2 hours later, and they will be 0803, 1100, and 0900. The discrepancy in the time zones used and the necessity of converting the times constantly back and forth to establish the actual hour an action occurred could easily cause a serious mix-up, perhaps even create a myth. That is precisely what happened to Samuel Eliot Morison, in whose history the myth first appears. In researching his volume on Midway, he relied heavily on the Naval War College analysis set in Zone +12, but he did examine some original sources. One that he saw was the Task Force 16 War Diary compiled by Spruance's staff. It was kept in Zone +10 time, or 2 hours later than the times with which he was familiar. He read this entry for 4 June. Time, Z +10. 0838, CTF-16, Spruance, informed Enterprise and Hornet that present intention was to launch attack groups about 0900. Search attack procedure, each group to attack 1 carrier. Force will continue to close after launch to about 100 miles. Here are all the key elements of the myth refuted in The Quiet Warrior. Spruance wanting to wait until 0900, zone plus 12 time, to launch when his carriers would have closed to within 100 miles of the target. Convert the times in the War Diary entry to Midway local time by subtracting 2 hours, as Morrison should have done, and a new picture emerges. There was to be no 3-hour delay. Spruance intended to launch his strike at 0700 Midway time and would thereafter continue to steam toward the enemy until he was within 100 miles of them. That information was tacked on to enable the pilots to find their carriers when they returned from the mission. Morrison, thinking he had discovered the reason for Browning's fame at Midway, was the one who created the fiction of Spruance's supposed desire to delay the launch. It did not arise from Browning's wartime reputation or from any recollections by participants. When specifically asked by Buell where he found the source of what has been here dubbed the myth, Morrison was unable to remember. Browning's credit for victory at Midway probably arose among naval aviators who thought that, because he was a pilot and Spruance was not, he must have been responsible for Task Force 16's success in the air. The pilots on board the Enterprise certainly did not go along with that. They had serious complaints about Browning's actions at Midway, and this is examined in detail for the first time in The Quiet Warrior. Browning's leadership was sorely tested and found to have serious flaws. His conduct there helps to explain his later problems as Halsey's Chief of Staff in the South Pacific and his eventual disgrace while captain of the 2nd Hornet, CV-12. In The Quiet Warrior, Buell exonerates Spruance of the blunder of planning to wait 3 hours to launch his attack. Not all historians have agreed with this assessment. Another aspect of Midway for which Spruance has been criticized, mainly by aviators, was his decision on the night of 4 June not to rush in headlong pursuit of the Japanese, who were withdrawing after the loss of their carriers. The pilots thought he should have headed west to enable them to attack the Japanese battleships and cruisers the next morning. As Buell rightly observed, Spruance feared running into more powerful forces at night, when his carriers would have done him no good. The Japanese sources have confirmed Spruance's apprehensions. Yet some still felt Spruance threw away an opportunity for complete victory at Midway, as if 4 carriers sunk was not enough. In treating Spruance's decisions leading up to the second controversial carrier action, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, 19 to 20 June 1944, Buell concluded that the Admiral's reasoning might indeed have been flawed. Spruance's Fifth Fleet was conducting the invasion of Saipan in the Marianas. While the battle raged ashore, Japanese carrier forces approached from the southwest with the intention of drawing the American carriers into a decisive, long-range battle. Spruance suspected that the Japanese might be seeking to lure his carriers away from Saipan in order to attack the transport force, loaded with troops and vital supplies. He refused to give his carrier commander, Vice Admiral Mark A. Mitcher, permission to steam to the west and attack the Japanese flat tops. Instead, he preferred to keep the carriers just west of Saipan and risk absorbing a long-range air attack so that they would be in position to deal with any Japanese force that might be approaching from another direction. On 19 June, the Japanese launched an all-out airstrike on the American carriers, only to suffer a tremendous defeat at the hands of Mitcher's fighter pilots. In an action that became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, almost all of the enemy aircraft were destroyed without inflicting significant damage on the Americans. Only after the Japanese attack had been repulsed did Spruance, convinced now that no Japanese end runs were bound for Saipan, release Mitcher's carriers to head west after the withdrawing Japanese. Late on the afternoon of 20 June, Mitcher dispatched a strike at maximum range just before sundown. His aviators sank 1 carrier and damaged 2 others. Submarines had sunk 2 big carriers the day before, but they suffered heavy losses in aircraft while trying to find and land on their flat tops after dark. Mitcher and the aviation community believed that Spruance had wasted a magnificent opportunity to smash the Japanese carrier force once and for all, and in daylight. Like most other historians of the action, Buell decided that Spruance should have gone after the Japanese carriers on 18 June, when they were first detected approaching the Marianas. Buell thought that in this instance, Spruance depended too much on what he believed the enemy commander would or would not do, and concluded that the Japanese posed a greater danger to the transports than to Mitcher's carriers. Another student of the battle, William T. Eblood, concurred with Mitcher's and Buell's assessments in his book Red Sun Setting, Annapolis, 1981. Of Spruance's decision to hold Mitcher back, Eblood commented, "If Spruance had been more conversant with the aviation capability of his fleet, perhaps he would have headed west for the decisive action." It has occurred to this writer that Spruance was probably conversant with the aviation capability of his fleet and knew that its far superior fighters, radar, and anti-aircraft guns could handle the Japanese air attacks. It appears as though he could not believe that the Japanese commander would be so bold as to challenge the American carriers to a slugfest, even at long range, and that the Japanese must have something else up their sleeve. They did not, and they paid for it. It is ironic that in the two carrier battles he fought, Spruance hurt the Japanese in two different ways. At Midway, all 4 Japanese carriers were sunk, but most of their aviators were saved. In the Philippine Sea, 6 of 9 carriers survived, but almost all of the aviators died. Either way, the result was the same. The Imperial Japanese Navy suffered crippling defeats. The constant was that every time Admiral Raymond A. Spruance commanded an operation against the Japanese, they lost. Thomas Bingham Buell, the author of The Quiet Warrior, was born in Detroit in 1936 and spent his boyhood on a farm in northern Michigan. Having at an early age set his sights on becoming a career naval officer, in 1954 he obtained an appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. At Annapolis, his favorite course was naval history. He discovered how much he liked doing historical research and writing. After graduation in 1958, he found in the Naval Institute Proceedings an outlet and forum where he could publish articles and exchange ideas. He is especially grateful to the Institute for its encouragement of junior officers as writers. Another source of intellectual satisfaction for Buell has been the Naval War College, where he was first a student and then on the staff. The high point of his naval career and the fulfillment of a childhood dream came in 1973 when he took command of the Joseph Hughes FF-1078, an Atlantic Fleet destroyer escort, later designated a frigate. Commander Buell retired from the Navy in 1979. Today, he lives in the Minneapolis area and is employed by Honeywell International. One historian whose works Buell has read closely is Samuel Eliot Morison. Despite inadvertently creating the Spruance-Browning launch myth at Midway, Morison, throughout his massive history of United States naval operations in World War II, treated Spruance with the utmost respect and admiration. This viewpoint was transmitted to Buell, who became deeply interested in the admiral. Because of his growing experience in writing naval history, he was able to transform his interest into a superb biography whose excellence was recognized by the Alfred Thayer Mahan Prize in Naval History. In 1980, he completed a second fine study of a famous naval officer, Master of Sea Power, a biography of Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King. In it, he deals with someone much different from Spruance in temperament, if nothing else, but he shows the same ability to draw out the essence of his subject and to render understandable his viewpoints and actions. Like The Quiet Warrior, it is also a classic of naval literature. John B. Lundstrom. Introduction. Raymond Ames Spruance was a professional naval officer, a warrior who commanded the greatest and most powerful fleet in the history of the world. His battleground was the Pacific Ocean, where he fought the sweeping naval campaigns of World War II. He began the war as an unknown rear admiral in command of 4 Pacific Fleet cruisers.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?